greater Knoxville area and region as we think about holistic health and safety for all children, families, and communities. So my partner in crime here, Mr. Clarence Bond, many of you know, we have co-chaired this initiative along with Dr. Bob Cronick, which I don't see, but I know there he is, somewhere close by. And so we're just, again, thrilled to have to continue the conversation. Quite frankly, last year we had a special session where we worked with, the FBI and KPD, but also our UT Police Department as we think about all things public safety and reimagining community safety. And so I just would like to take this opportunity to welcome you. At 1:30, we had a session on campus that was absolutely phenomenal, and we are pleased to see some faces from earlier today, but quite frankly, we've got a lot of 90% of the people that I see are new faces, Dr. Taylor, so we're super excited for that. Dr. Henry Taylor hails from Buffalo by way of Memphis, so he's a Tennessean at heart, I guess we might say, as we think about his journey and where he grew up and where he was trained and so on and so forth. So without further ado, I'd like to bring up Mr. Clarence Bond to offer some opening remarks as we think about this joint partnership.
Good evening. All right. I feel back at home, honestly, to be here with you at the Beck Cultural Exchange Center. So definitely thank you to Reverend Renee Kessler, Columbia, and the staff for having us here hosting this event. I'll be brief because we have an exciting program for you, starting off with Dr. Henry Taylor. But for those who don't know me, my name is Clarence Bond. I currently serve as the Director for the Office of Diversity and Community Relations at the Haslam College of Business. Formerly, I served as our City of Knoxville Park Director for the Police Advisory and Review Committee, so I was very honored to serve alongside many others, many I see in the room, and working under the leadership of Mayor Madeline Rogero. We welcome you tonight. Tonight, we really want to talk about ways to keep not only our community safe, making sure we're looking at coalition building as well for our community. So we're very thankful for our panelists, very thankful for also co-hosting with Dr. Samuel and the UT of Knoxville. But really, it's all about our community members tonight, so please feel free to engage. We'll have a time for you to do roundtable discussions with our panelists. So very unique. It's not going to be here in lecture style. We're going to have more informative discussions. So thank you so much for attending. And I'm going to ask Dr. Bob Cronick to come up and we'll introduce our speaker and start our program. Thank you so much for attending.
Well, for those of you that are here this afternoon, I'm here to apologize. Henry was sort of black and quiet and he gets so excited. Not. Henry and I have been friends for 15 years. We were just having a drink out on Gay Street and talking to a graduate student. It was mine here at the University of Tennessee. And you can?
Speak into the microphone.
I just hit better? Thank you very much. Sorry about that. Anyway, his name is Gavin, and Gavin was one of the best students I ever worked with. And I'm not very altruistic. That can tell you I cheat on the tennis court. But I sent Gavin to study with Henry. We were in Philadelphia at a meeting, and I said, Henry, I've given him all I can. And Henry is super smart. He gets involved in the community. He really cares. He's got a couple of kids that are pretty interesting. One of them argues with me over the virtues of Emmitt Smith. I happen to like Emmitt Smith. So I think you're in for a real treat. And thank you all for coming. Henry.
It's a tremendous pleasure to be here with you this evening. Knoxville is a special place to me. I'm a native Tennessean from Nashville, Tennessee, and my family originally is from the Memphis area, was born while I was in grad school here in Knoxville. So it is a very special place to me, and it's a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon to discuss the challenge of public safety in the age of urban violence and the lessons learned from our experience with the mass shooting in Buffalo, New York. My presentation will consist of 3 parts. In the first part, I discuss the Buffalo mass shooting. Then I explore the question, why is America so violent? And lastly, I address the challenge of public safety in the age of urban violence. On a hot Saturday afternoon, on May 14th, 2020, an 18-year-old white supremacist, Peyton S. Gendron, calmly walked into a Tops supermarket located on Buffalo's East Side black community and started killing people. The racist selected Buffalo because it had one of the largest concentration of blacks in New York State, and because of the symbolic value of killing African Americans in a city with a black mayor and a progressive population. Gendron, from a small rural town 200 miles away in New York's southern tier, also knew that the Tops Market was the only supermarket for the East Side's 68,000 African Americans, and the store would be filled with shoppers on a Saturday afternoon. He came to the city to kill as many black people as possible. And when his shooting spree was over, the racist had murdered 10 African Americans. 10 African Americans, wounded 1 black and 2 whites. Gendron appeared to be the lone gunman, but he was probably part of a more extensive network of autonomous underground soldiers associated with the radical right wing. Shooter spent months in the South planning his attack and made several trips to Buffalo preparing for it. The evidence suggests that Gendron might have shared his plans with 6 other people, including a retired federal agent. Regardless, one thing is certain. He obtained insights and advice on equipment and guns from a variety of online sources. And before the attack, he posted a 180-page manifesto outlining his reasons for the assault. Then Gendron mounted a camera on his military helmet and live streamed his murderous rampage. An analysis of Gendron's manifesto indicate that the Great Replacement theory was the animating force behind the Tops massacre. At its core, this theory posits that people of color threaten white people's political, social, and economic rights, as well as their very survival in the United States. Therefore, to paraphrase the late influential white supremacist David Blaine, the shooter believed that his task was to secure the existence of white people and the future for white children. On reflection, the Great Replacement theory appears to be nothing more than a repackaging of the notion of reverse discrimination popularized in the 1970s. No matter. The bottom line is that Gendron's killing spree had political underpinnings, and his ideological framework is generalizable to the discourse found in mainstream right-wing politics. The Tops Massacre shocked people across the nation. Buffalo's Mayor Byron Brown called the killings an unthinkable, horrific action and denounced it as an act of domestic terrorism fueled by racial hatred. The mayor said, "This has been a very long and painful for our community. People are in trauma. We're healing, wrapping our arms around each other and doing everything we can to get through this most painful time in our history." President Biden came to Buffalo and denounced the mass shooting, saying it ran counter to everything we stand for in America, and that hate must have no safe harbor in our nation. The sentiments of these local and national leaders notwithstanding, the Top shooting raises the question, why is America so violent? The Top shooting was a tragic and heartbreaking event. So it is vital that we determine what lessons we can learn from it. The first lesson is that the Tops mass shooting was not an aberration in American society. The United States is a very violent country. And to stop the assaults and gun violence, we must know why. For example, on May 24th, just 10 days after the Buffalo mass shooting, a rampage occurred at an elementary school in Uvalde, Texas, leaving 19 children and 2 teachers dead. According to the Gun Violence Archives, 362 shootings occurred in America during the 6 months following the Tops shooting. And by October this year, there had been 595 mass shootings in the United States. To put these figures into perspective, using a definition similar to the Gun Violence Archives, the Rockefeller Institute in a study of mass shootings over a 55-year period, stretching from 1966 to 2020, found that 402 mass shootings took place over that span. We have already passed that number in 2022. Even more significant, public mass shootings are only one form of gun violence. When we add assaults and other non-mass shootings to the equation, including hate crimes and police killings, the violent character of American society is amplified dramatically. Thus, the mass shootings at the Top store is symptomatic of a larger and more significant problem of urban violence. Thus, to understand why an 18-year-old white racist came to Buffalo to kill people, we must determine the cause of urban violence in America. To accomplish this task, we must expand our definition of violence. We must expand this definition. Most studies of violence focus on gun violence and physical assaults, including rapes. However, in Buffalo, we realize that these episodic, sensational, and loud forms of violence pale beside the quiet violence plaguing the African American community, especially the violence of the living place. The violence of living in marginalized, underdeveloped, and forgotten neighborhoods that curtail the life chances of the residents and produce unnecessary death and dying. For these reasons, we must extend our concept of violence to include violence of the living place. The violence found in these marginalized, underdeveloped neighborhoods is not random or accidental, but instead represent the inevitable and predictable outcome of the accumulated choices, decisions, and predatory actions of public officials and greedy entrepreneurs. The point is this: in Buffalo, systemic structural racism built the segregated, unhealthy, and underdeveloped black neighborhoods visited by the individual white races that killed the African Americans. For example, TOPS sits in an urban landscape that reflects the ugly reality of American apartheid. Surrounding the store are hundreds of unhealthy, substandard rental housing that are infested with rats and filled with lead and situated among unkept vacant lots and neglected sidewalks. At the same time, many of the shoppers at TOPS battle with joblessness, low incomes, poverty, and toxic stress. Next to the TOPS, near the TOPS store, Route 33, the Kensington Expressway, cuts through the East Side black community, devaluing owner-occupied housing, and spewing tons of noise and pollution into the environment. These unhealthy, underdeveloped neighborhood conditions restrict African Americans' life chances, constructs pathways to adverse health outcomes, and produce black on black violence. The result is that most black Buffalonians don't live long and healthy lives. Indeed, a staggering 52% differential exists in the premature death rate between blacks and whites in the Buffalo. And this agony of hundreds of years of potential black life lost because of neighborhood conditions explain why we must expand the definition of violence. On this point, we also learned that stopping violence in America requires understanding its cultural foundation. I theorize that the frequency and intensity of violence in America reflects a disregard or trivialization of human life. In other words, American culture marginalizes and undervalues human dignity. The human dignity doctrine refers to the value and preciousness of human life, which is situated at the very apex of societal values. Human dignity is thus an invaluable right that must be respected, maintained, and protected at all costs. And within this context, every human being has the right to live in dignity. Every human being has the right to live in dignity. What does this mean? If human life is precious, if human life is precious, society is responsible for building physical and social environments that enable people to thrive and reach their full human potential. The United Nations, in its Universal Declaration of Human Rights, outline the fundamental principles that will allow people to live in dignity. Every person has a right to a job that pays a living wage and live in communities that nurture and help them grow and develop. People have a right to access quality health care, obtain an education that prepares them to work and fully participate in society. And all people have a right to political freedom. Given this definition, Americans do not doubt the sanctity of human life and reject human dignity as the engine that drives city building and socio-economic development. This trivialization of human life provides insight into the violent nature of American society. Part of the problem is that many Americans do not take gun violence seriously and minimize the significance of the impact that it is having on society. For example, according to the Pew Research Institute, 1 in 5 Americans think that political violence is justifiable. And nearly half the country expects a civil war in the future. Moreover, although gun violence grew by 43% between 2010 and 2020, 61% of whites and 52% of all Americans do not believe that it is a big problem. And a staggering 57% of Republicans think that gun violence is either a minor issue or not a problem at all. The historian Richard Hofstadter suggests that Americans trivialize violence because they have mythologized, ignored, and repressed their violent past, causing them to suffer from historical amnesia. Nevertheless, through endless television shows, movies, cartoons, and video games, Americans have recreated a fantasized history that glorifies violence and etches it into the nation's popular culture. Americans' violent culture is rooted in the nation's origin as a settler society based on slave labor. As a white settler nation with expansionist aims, wars of aggression were fought against the indigenous populations, and the settlers forged their identity by othering, dehumanizing, and subjugating the indigenous population. They called them savages to justify the violent appropriation of their lands and internment on Indian reservations. During the age of Indian wars, being an American meant that you rationalized, supported, and celebrated the fight against the indigenous population. Because of the protracted nature of these wars, the Second Amendment to the Constitution enshrined the principles of a civil and military virtue by making every soldier a citizen and every citizen a soldier, thereby indirectly enlisting all citizens in the battle against the indigenous population. These Indian wars played a central role in shaping America's culture. The nation celebrated and glorified these aggressive wars of imperialism, and generations of Americans, inspired by movies and television shows, grew up playing cowboys and Indians, endlessly repeating the battles against the indigenous population. The white settlers also extended the othering population to the enslaved African population. Plantation owners stripped blacks of their culture, language, and names as part of the enslavement process and forced them to work on plantations. In this situation, black slaves created the wealth that fueled America's extraordinary growth and development. At the same time, this oppression and exploitation turned slave workers into a potentially powerful revolutionary force, feared by white Americans. Consequently, because of the omnipresent dangers of insurrection, whites used guns and violence to control, patrol, and terrorize the enslaved population. After the slave epoch ended, blacks were forced into a new oppressive system based on sharecropping and tenant farming. In this new context, whites used terror and legal and extra-legal violence to control them. The Ku Klux Klan was the South's primary terrorist organization. Founded in the aftermath of the Civil War, it rapidly spread across the South and used cross burnings and lynching to threaten and intimidate African Americans, thereby carving race-based violence into Southern life and culture. Across the South, whites spectacularized the killing of blacks by turning lynchings into festive occasions. These and other violent acts, including the internment of the Japanese during the World War II and the rise of mass incarcerations in the 70s, reflects the actions of a nation that trivializes human dignity and devalues human life. In the United States, we have constructed a hierarchical, race-based society where some people's lives matter more than others. Animating this hierarchical structure is a system of systemic structural racism and social class inequality that exploits and oppresses the population, especially blacks and people of color. This type of oppressive environment gives rise to an oppositional culture where groups, including the white working class, are constantly fighting to expand their freedoms, thereby giving rise to even more violence. This situation creates a classic case of violence begetting more violence and explains why a movement emerged in 2012 following the acquittal of George Zimmerman and the shooting death of Trayvon Martin with the hashtag Black Lives Matter. In this context, we learn that blacks, more than any other group, are the prime targets of American violence. In 2020, for example, FBI data indicated that black Americans made up more than half the victims of the 8,052 reported hate crimes against African Americans. And these hate crimes against blacks continue to rise. At the same time, according to the Washington Post, blacks are killed by the law enforcement at more than twice the rate of whites. Indeed, more than 300 blacks have been killed by the police since the brutal murder of George Floyd in 2020. In addition to the dangers coming from the anti-black haters and the police, African Americans must also grapple with black-on-black violence. The late historian Michael Katz said that black-on-black violence resulted from three interrelated causes. One, from the internalization of self-hatred. Two, not understanding the causes of black oppression. And three, living in decaying neighborhoods with few opportunities and no hope. In these settings, Katz said that black rage is turned inward and redirected toward other blacks, rather than outward against the symbols of oppression and exploitation, as was the case in the 60s and 70s. The result is that gun violence are very problematic in the African American community, and consequently significant differences between blacks and whites over this issue. Only 39% of whites believe that violence is a big issue, while a staggering 82% of African Americans, or 8 out of 10 blacks, say that gun violence is the nation's top problem. Lastly, not only must African Americans grapple with black-on-black violence, but they must also confront the silent violence of living in substandard housing, situated in communities characterized by physical and social conditions that spawn frequent visits by the grim reaper of unnecessary death, disease, and suffering. On this last point, I really want to stress that black-on-black violence is a characteristic feature of living-place violence, rather than a separate category or genre of violence. So, what is to be done? In this challenging age of urban violence, we must reimagine the American system of public safety. I broadly define public safety as protecting the people by ensuring that they reside in healthy, secure homes in nurturing communities where people earn a living wage and have access to health services, food security, and vital institutions, along with a robust social safety net to secure them during hard times. The starting point in the development of this system of protecting Americans is to attack the root causes of violence in America. And this requires centering human dignity and disrupting America's violent culture by eliminating the social, economic, and political forces that produce and reproduce it. Thus, to stop the violence, senseless killing, and unnecessary disease and death, we must invest in people and rebuild the marginalized and undeveloped neighborhoods where they live. This is what I mean by the preciousness of human life. If human life is precious, then you must create environments that preserve, protect, and develop that life. You must create a world where society says to them every day, we care. And when we create that type of environment, the people who live in those settings will also say, we care. Because if you create an environment that tells them we don't care, that you're nothing and meaningless, then they will respond by saying, if you don't care, then I don't care. If my life is meaningless, then your life is meaningless. That's why human dignity lies at the center of this. That's why we must understand how we must build a society that really demonstrates that we believe in the preciousness of human life. Within this context, in communities, black communities where black-on-black violence is problematic, we must develop robust, community-based violence prevention programs to complement the radical neighborhood transformation process. These prevention programs, to be effective, must meet 4 threshold requirements. First, programs must be well-funded, financially sustainable, and pay the outreach workers a livable wage with good benefits. Understand that. Under-resourced and financed programs about violence prevention never ever succeed. You can try, but you will fail 10 out of 10 times. Second, the programs must be professionally run and staffed with violence prevention workers with deep roots in the target community. And because of the high stress associated with violent preventions, these workers must be provided with mental health support and stress reduction programs. Anybody that works in those environments, you know that's high stress. And you gotta help the people who are in those situations. Fourth, these programs must stress peaceful means of resolving conflicts and include educational programs that teach the kids about the forces that oppress their communities and continually reproduce the conditions that are found there. We have to tell the truth. We have to explain why these conditions persist. And lastly, these violence prevention programs must have robust, formative, and summative evaluation systems attached to them. We have to evaluate this stuff because we need to know what works and why, and what does not work and why. In closing, I want to stress that the violence prevention programs will never succeed without raising the political consciousness of the residents. And without centering human dignity and tethering that to the development of authentic neighborhood transformation projects, in which the young people and kids are actively participating in helping to rebuild their communities as they rebuild their lives. However, in the end, to stop the violence and hate, we must transform America's culture by centering human dignity and anti-racism. To reach this lofty goal, we must confront our greatest challenge, facing the hard reality that America is a very violent society that needs deep structural transformation. If we can face that reality, then we will be able to liberate our minds and imagine another, very different, but possible America. A place that is more democratic, a place where human dignity and anti-racism are the engines that drive our cultural, economic, social, democratic, and political development.